It's a pleasure to introduce Frederike Petzschner. She is now at the Carney Institute for Brain Science at Brown University. And I have to make a little personal note. I got to know Frederike many years ago when she was still in Zurich, in Switzerland. And at that stage, I was already impressed by her presentation. So I'm really keen to hear what she's been doing over the last years. And the title of her talk is very straightforward: Computational Psychiatry. So here you are.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? I'm usually too small for those poles, but I hope that's good. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about computational psychiatry, but before I do that, I want to tell you that I am an assistant professor at the Carney Institute for Brain Science, but I also have a second hat on, which is I co-direct a program which is called Brainstorm, and Brainstorm is really trying to accelerate computational brain science and neuroscience into real-world applications. So that can be commercialization, but that can actually also be building open source software, and we fund scientists who kind of live at the interface between the real world and the science. So if you're very interested in that, come and reach out and ask more questions about Brainstorm. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about mental health first, because in this program we've heard a lot about AI, but I want to point something out that has been really evolving over the last couple of years, which is that we have an increasing mental health crisis. Just to give you an example, the numbers of depression diagnoses during COVID or after COVID have changed by a factor of 3. And if we're looking just at the demand for the healthcare system, there's a rapid increase in demand across the board. So it doesn't just mean depression, there's changes in anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, trauma-related disorder, feeding, sleep-wake disorders, etc., etc. So really across the board, what we're seeing is an increase in diagnosis, an increased need in demand for psychiatric disorders. And I think this is part of why we're having this meeting today, is to talk about how AI tools could actually potentially help us improve mental well-being. And there's many ways in which they can do this, and a lot of it has already kind of reached the stage of companies. So there's different ways that I've seen this being implemented. One is optimization, where you're really trying to think about the particular path that someone is going through, and if you could actually allow them to have better healthcare access. For instance, Spring Health is a company that was funded by a neuroscientist where they provide online therapy. There's improvements in diagnostics. There have been ways to kind of think about monitoring and prevention. So earlier on, someone asked about addiction. There was an app. I don't know if it still exists because the company actually plummeted. But they were trying to detect whether you were close to the location where you used to take in your drug and warn you for it, because the chances of drug intake in the original context is a lot higher. So there have been systems like that that have been built. And we also heard a little bit about digital therapeutics earlier today. 2 of those companies on here no longer exist, and we can also talk about why that is, because I don't think it's just a lack of efficiency. I think it's also that the system has to change and adapt faster to it. But I want to take a moment to really say what are the challenges right now and the things that we should not be overlooking before we get overly excited. So kind of what is the but? And I would say the but in one context is that many of the solutions that we see in AI, they actually, and specifically in the context of mental health, they're often a digital version of an existing concept or a solution. So for instance, think of WooBot. You can now use a chatbot that is talking to you, and it provides cognitive behavioral therapy. But that doesn't really tell us more about how to treat differently or how we could develop new drugs that are actually affecting mental health. And that has to do with mental health in general and psychiatry in general, and we need to talk about this for a little bit. So just take the example of kind of the issue with gold standards, and I want to take one company just as an example. I really don't know anything about Ellipsis Help other than the paper that they published, but I think it's a good example of what you typically see. So here, basically what they proposed is that they take a voice sample of an individual's prompted, so they basically ask you how you're feeling, and you're giving a response, and the response could be around 5 minutes altogether. Then they use deep learning, and the idea is to predict your individual depression and anxiety score. And then that could basically be delivered to a care team in order to provide actionable results, which basically means putting you in touch with a psychiatrist or a psychologist. So they said they're clinically validated, so I looked at the paper, and this is something that Aldo also mentioned earlier, that most of those papers are actually not in the best journals. But in this particular case, what they did is they actually looked at those 5-minute voice samples, and they were trying to validate it against something else. So they took 5 minutes each week over 6 weeks, and then what they predicted is the PHQ. Some of you might know that questionnaire. It's the patient health questionnaire. It consists, in this particular case, of 8 questions. And then what they calculate is something like an ROC curve, or basically an idea to say how many times do you correctly detect whether someone has a depression as opposed to when you are falsely detecting that they have a depression. So now let's think about this for a second. To what degree is that actually meaningful for us? First of all, you would need 6 weeks of data for 5 minutes each, versus 30 minutes altogether from voice samples. But you could also have gotten the exact same results by taking 8 questions, which is going to take you less than 5 minutes. And that is not a problem technically with voice data, because I think there might be actually a lot of meaningful information in voice data, but we have to benchmark it to the standard classical tools that we have out there. And it's not going to inform us about treating a patient differently if they had taken that questionnaire as opposed to if they had used this for 6 weeks. So what I think we need to talk a little bit about is the elephant in the room. And I think the elephant in the room in psychiatry is that the key problem is often not to get a label or a diagnosis, but the key problem is often understanding how to treat individuals over longer periods of time. And we're not really good at treating patients yet with mental disorders. And so what do I mean by that? Just take the example of depression. If you're diagnosed with depression, you typically start on an SSRI. The chances of, as a first responder, to respond to an SSRI are somewhere, depending on which study you look at, between 30 and 45%. And then actually after 3 or 4 weeks, you might switch to the next medication. And then again, your chances are even lower. So a lot of treatment still is trial and error treatment. And I think that's a big issue that has been contributing to the way we're treating mental disorders. So to get a bit of a sense of why that is, I want us to look at medicine and imagine we are living 100 years back in the day, and we wake up one morning and you have yellow eyes. Then back then you would go and see a doctor, and the doctor would say, oh, you have the yellow eye disease, because that's your symptom. And then maybe they find a good name for it. For instance, icteria is what it was used to be called 100 years ago. And nowadays, 100 years fast forward, we know that there's actually different reasons why you might be waking up with yellow eyes. There could be changes in your blood constellation, it could be changes in the liver, it could be viral, metabolic, autoimmunological. So there are mechanisms and causes that create the symptom that we're observing. And so what would you do now? Well, you would likely do a blood test in order to figure out what is the most likely underlying cause, and based on that test, you would deliver a treatment. So really, we have moved away from symptom-based diagnosis to much more mechanistic and causal diagnosis in classical medicine. And I think that's really been one of the progressions that we have seen. It's not true, obviously, for all fields, but it's true for many fields. So now fast forward to psychiatry today. In psychiatry, you're not being diagnosed based on a symptom, but you're diagnosed based on a syndrome. So for instance, take the example of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, there's different symptoms. For instance, delusions, hallucinations, formal thought disorder, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior. If you show up with more than 2 or 2 or more, you might be diagnosed with schizophrenia, which first of all means that 2 patients may not be overlapping in a single symptom, but both be diagnosed with schizophrenia. It could also be that patients who fully overlap in their symptoms are being treated with the same medication, but they are not actually responding to the medication. So the way that is typically done is the diagnosis is done based on a book. The book is the DSM when you're in the United States. It's the ICD when you are in Europe. And what often is missing and has been criticized before is any mechanistic or causal insight into what has been causing those symptoms. And so basically what we're treating is syndromes, but we're not treating causes and mechanisms in psychiatry. In that lack of insight, the big hope has been that neuroscience could actually contribute to that lack of insight and therefore improve the way we're treating, not just based on symptoms, but based on mechanisms. Okay. So where are we in this endeavor? This is a paper that came out about 10 years ago. It was written by Tom Insel, who used to be the former director of the NIMH, and it basically asked that question: why has it taken so long for biological psychiatry to develop clinical tests and what to do about it? Well, the why question is an interesting one because there's many reasons why it's been taking so long. One is that I think we have been taking the DSM a little bit too serious. So there could be that there's actually multiple reasons that are causing depression. We're seeing one symptom. If you're just focusing on the existing classifications, we'll actually not make tangible impacts onto saying we're treating different subgroups with different medications. But the problem in general is that it's a large spectrum of heterogeneity, and something that Aldo was mentioning earlier is that mental disorders often have comorbid physical disorders. I'm very interested in pain, where the overlap between what's in the body and what's in the brain actually becomes much more blurry. So it's a very, very complex disorder, and it's a disorder often of the brain. So that's part of what has been contributing to it, is the complexity, but also the way that we've been focusing on diagnostic categories. The question is what to do about it too, and I really think it's a worthwhile paper. I think there's multiple things we can do about it, and I want to talk about two just for now. The very first one is to try to see if we can get additional disease insights. And so basically the idea is to say, can we find something out about the individual that tells us a mechanistic difference or a causal difference for a mental disorder? And then is this in some way meaningful because it has predictive validity, which means I can actually say that someone might be more likely to benefit from one type of therapy as opposed to another one. And both of these have their challenges. So let's talk about disease insight first. How could we gain new insights into psychiatric disorders? And if you go back to Tom Insel's time at the NIMH, one big endeavor has been focusing on genetics and trying to see, are there actually genetic variations that allow us to predict mental disorders and also their treatments? But it turned out it's actually a highly complex problem because, yes, there are genetics components both to depression, schizophrenia, many other mental disorders, but it turns out that there's usually not a single variation in a gene that you can pinpoint, and it also has not been informing us that much about treatments yet. Interesting enough, funny side anecdote, after he left the NIMH, he was actually the co-founder of another company which was called Mindstrong. Mindstrong used the interaction with, in this case, the smartphone as kind of brain-computer interactions, and was trying to use sensor data, like the way you would be typing on your phone, so much more the type of data that Aldo was talking about, and used machine learning technology to try to phenotype people, individuals, based on their interactions with the phone. It was a highly promising company, but actually also no longer exists. Again, we could talk about why maybe later on. Then what happened afterwards? Well, in around 2016, Joshua Gordon took over, and he's the new director of the NIMH. And one of the first articles that came out back in the day was saying that he said we need to be much more serious about mathematics, which seemed kind of an odd request in the context of psychiatry. And what he meant is that there should be a push towards a field that is called computational psychiatry. And what I want to do today is give you a bit of an idea of what computational psychiatry does, where it could be useful, but also where the challenges lie. So what's the basic idea to understand this? Well, if you think about the classical assays that I was talking about, then you want to think about, say I want to understand something about a liver problem, then I need to think about the function of the liver. Part of the function of the liver is to actually clean the blood. So one way to potentially test if there is a dysfunction is to use a blood test. So then the analogy would be, well, what are the functions of the brain? And one of the things that the brain does is it actually performs computation. So you can think of perception as a computation. You can think of learning as a computation. So really what you want to do is, if you want to probe dysfunctions of the brain, you might want to probe those cognitive processes, and you could technically use computational models in order to try to understand if there are deficits in learning or in perception. And so models could actually act as assays of computation as much as a blood test could act as an assay of understanding liver function. So that was the original idea. The field really was more or less started in 2012, and since then it's been taking off quite rapidly. And there's a bit of a joke that there's more high-rank review papers on it than there's actual data papers. And I think that has to do with the fact that it's actually quite young. But there is a lot of excitement generally across computational cognitive neuroscience to use these types of methods to better understand brain function. So So if you look at computational psychiatry, there's really two subcategories, and we already heard this earlier today. One is data-driven approaches. So you could say I'm taking large samples from basically brain imaging data or behavioral data, and I could try to just classify, but ideally predict, for instance, treatment response to an SSRI just based on, say, brain activity data. There's an alternative to that, which would be called theory-driven. Theory-driven is saying, oh no, actually we are neuroscientists, we understand something about the underlying cognitive process. So that could be simple models of cognition and computational models of, for instance, learning or perception, but also much more complex biophysical models. And you could say, okay, I know something about dopamine functioning in the basal ganglia, and I want to use that as a way to inform how I'm making, for instance, better predictions. So, for a while, we've been treating them a little bit in their own pockets. There's many suggestions to marry those, and that's really what's been happening in standard or the novel papers that I see in computational psychiatry, where you use, for instance, these theory-driven approaches to do really what you can call kind of a dimensionality reduction, where suddenly you get meaningful parameters that tell you something about cognitive function, and you combine it with, for instance, machine learning in order to make better predictions or classifications. So really, nowadays, we see those being merged, but what I will talk about for most of this lecture is about the theory-driven approaches, and you heard a lot about the data-driven approaches already earlier today. So one question that you might be asking is, okay, why should I use a model? Why don't I just take recordings of behavioral data or brain imaging? Why would you actually want to use computational models in this particular context? And if we take the example of learning, there's a couple of advantages that models have above and beyond just pure behavioral data. One is that actually they allow you to translate both tasks, but also your assessments across species, which is often very hard to do. So you can actually have a model of learning from prediction errors that both explains the behavior in a rat model or mouse model, but it also explains it in a human. The other one is that you actually can quantify behavior in a way that is means that, for instance, you have a parameter estimate that tells you something about the speed of learning in a particular context, and then that allows you to basically reduce the dimensionality. Or you could even say, maybe people have different strategies of learning, and I'll give you an example for that later on, and you can compare models and see which best describes the actual behavior, what's the mechanism underlying the behavior. And there have been simulations like this one on the right-hand side showing that by doing that, you can actually be much better at predicting because you're removing literally noise from the data. And then I think the most interesting when we think about the development of new drugs is that you can actually think about biological implementations. And that type of insight will basically, if you have a model that describes the function of neurotransmitter systems, could actually allow you to make predictions of what could be new drug treatments or new drug targets for psychiatric disorders. And for instance, one example could be the role of dopamine in temporal difference learning, but there's many others. Okay, so for the next couple of minutes, what I want to do is just give you not the detailed explanation of kind of what the models exactly do, but an idea of how you could approach questions using computational psychiatry in two really fundamentally different ways. And the example that I want to take in both of those cases is actually OCD. So many of you have probably heard of obsessive compulsive disorder. It is a disorder where you have a set of symptoms that are around either compulsions, where you're repeating behaviors very often, or obsessive thoughts, where you have these ruminating thoughts. Here's, for instance, a description of a patient who has OCD. And they would describe it as, I have to check the computer 1,000,000 times to make sure I haven't left anything open on it. Sometimes I write it down on a piece of paper, nothing on screen at 5:23, for example, which helps. I have to pick up the phone and check to make sure it's hung up, which doesn't always help because then I think I hung it up wrong when I checked, so I just unplug it. So this kind of gives you a bit of a sense of these repetitive behaviors. And a lot of people use OCD now very colloquially, but patients who are suffering from that, they often suffer from that for many, many hours a day. It's a highly disabling disorder, and we need to understand better what is happening there. Interesting enough, when you look at the history of science around OCD, there have been different phases with different proposals of what's happening during OCD. A very early one proposal was that maybe it's memory deficits. You do something and you forgot that you actually executed it, and because you forgot, you have to do it again or you have to check again. Another much more prominent theory has come from a work consortium that was more driven by clinicians, where the idea is it's actually a disorder of dysfunctional beliefs. So here the question was, for instance, if you overestimate the threat of not doing something in particular, then that might lead you to repeat your behavior more and more often. So we've all experienced that part of it during a phase of, for instance, the COVID epidemic, where suddenly everybody would wash their hands a lot more often because there was a high cost to pay if you didn't. And so that could be one of the drivers of repetitive behavior, the sense of responsibility and also an intolerance to uncertainty, so really wanting to be sure that something was done right. That wasn't a very computational theory, though, so it's very hard to test with computational models, but there came a phase where people talk more about computational models for OCD, and that came from the field of habit formation and animal work, actually, where we're saying you also see repetitive behaviors in animals, and there it's often different. It's not really goal-directed in that you have a goal that you want to achieve with your action, but you're habitual, and you basically become overly habitual, so you're just repeating actions without actually thinking about them. And so maybe it's a form of very excessive habit formation. Another way to explain this, though, is to say, well, you can be still very goal-directed. You can actually say, I want to achieve something, but I have a hard time understanding that the state of the world has changed. So, for instance, if I clean my hands, I still don't believe that they actually got clean due to the action, so I'm repeating the action again, which is a different way of thinking about it, because one is way more goal-directed, the other one is more habitual. And so when you wanted to test something like that and try to understand what the mechanisms are, then for this last part, we were thinking about particular ways of actually trying to get insights into that. And why I got very interested in understanding state and structure learning is because it has been actually heavily associated with the orbitofrontal cortex, which is also the main regions where you see aberrations in OCD. And it turns out that can be particularly modulated by SSRIs, or serotonin, specifically in the OFC, and serotonin turns also to be the go-to drug treatment for OCD. So there may be an interesting link to how the drug might be functioning in the way we're learning about the environment that you could explore by understanding the relationship between OCD and structural learning. So, how could you approach something like that, if that's your hypothesis or the thing you want to test? Well, one way to approach this, and this is standard, I would say, what you see in terms of computational psychiatry and cognitive modeling is you come up with an experiment that is actually testing that in an individual. You're acquiring data, and then you have different models that are trying to describe the specific underlying behavior. Then you compare those models, and either you try to find which is the best model explaining the data, either there's one model that is explaining the data particularly well, and you try to relate that to symptom severity, so that could be some parameter estimate you're extracting from the model. Or, on the other hand, you say there's actually different learning strategies, and I find that different models are, there's different subgroups that use different strategies in a particular paradigm. So in this case, what we did is we did something quite related to that. We basically used a paradigm where we had people learn structure. In this case, it was shells, so you could decide to crack those shells open. They had seasons. Sometimes they're in a particularly good season, sometimes they're in a bad season. So it's a bit like, I'm living in New England now. I didn't used to eat oysters, but I feel like I'm obliged now that I moved to this place. And so you have seasons where you particularly want to collect your oysters, and others where you really don't want to do that. And so here the idea is that for every single shell, people had to basically learn when it is in a good phase or when it's in a bad phase, and then basically collect it in this particular moment in time. We had two groups. We gave some people escitalopram, which is an SSRI, it's just a single dose, and the other group basically just received a placebo, because we wanted to see the influence of drugs on learning. And then what you do is you acquire data. You see that people actually have a good way of learning the particular task you're tested on. Again, I don't want to go into detail, but then you can come up with a set of models. In this case, we actually used very different sets of models, a whole bunch of models that basically said you're not learning any structure, but you're repeating what used to be good, and you stop doing what used to be bad. So that's a stimulus-response learning model that's much more habitual, as opposed to someone who says, no, actually I learned something about the season of the shell, and based on which season I think that shell is in, I'm going to pick it or not. So I learned structure. And these are nested models. In this case, we're using reinforcement learning, and this is actually a Bayesian observer model. And basically you can now say, okay, which out of these 16 models best explains the observed behavior? And there's many, many different ways of doing this now to basically do model comparison. In this case, we used a method called Bayesian model comparison. We inferred the parameters of the models using MCMC. That's basically a way just to simulate. And what you end up seeing is there's one particular model that explains the data a lot better than all of the other models. Then you also want to define whether that's actually just a bad model out of many bad models, or if it really can capture the structure you see in the behavior next. But the interesting thing in this case was it could explain our behavioral effects, but now how does what you're getting out of the model actually relate to symptomatology, for instance? So in this particular case, you take a winning model and you relate it to how obsessive compulsive are individuals, and you see that the more you have a tendency to learn structure, the less OCD traits we observed. And then the other question that you wanted to have is how does it relate to drug plasma levels of an SSRI? And the higher the drug plasma level was, the better they were actually at structural learning in this particular paradigm. So that kind of fitted into this general idea. Okay, there is a relationship between the repetitive behaviors that you see here in structural learning, and it can be modulated by drugs. I just wanted to give you this not as a solution to what SSRI do in OCD. I think there's way more to it. But I wanted to give it to you as an idea to understand how some of these classical paradigms in computational psychiatry look like. But one of the problems with that is often that we tend to then sit in one niche and explain one problem, but we're not explaining everything that has been out there, and we're not even relating different theories in this particular case of OCD to one another. So just using this basically tells us, yeah, maybe there are learning deficits, but how does it relate to the fact that for a long time people have observed these dysfunctional beliefs, they couldn't relate it to behavior. So isn't there a way to actually try to start to combine theories using models? And so one that I was particularly interested in is trying to understand how we can actually describe beliefs. And beliefs are a hard one, because when you think about how would I study beliefs in humans, then one way I could do this is I could get groups of humans in and change a specific belief, which is actually already hard to do. And then I would have to do that for every single belief and see how it is actually changing behavior. And that's a tricky experiment to do in general. The alternative could be to say, okay, can we just take a very simple scenario and simulate how agents would act under different beliefs? So basically what we did here is we said, let's take the most simple symptom-provoking scenario we could think of, describe it with a model that explains what might be going on in this particular scenario, and then simulate agents that act under different beliefs about the environment and see which of those agents would actually start to display symptomatic behaviors and which ones won't. And again, you have to define all of this very well. And then you could get subsets of individuals and understand how they differ in their specific beliefs. So you could get a sense of which beliefs are causal and which beliefs are just consequences of certain behaviors. So to give you the analogy again, the example that I like to use in OCD is that we were really interested in trying to understand how these fears of harming others, the worries about contaminations actually could be described. So we came up with a very simple model. In this case, this is a partially observable Markov decision process where you say your hands can be in two states. They can either be dirty or they can be clean. You can interact with the world like cooking. There's a certain probability that your hands will get dirty after you cook. And there's a certain probability that when they are dirty, you're actually poisoning your friends, for instance, while cooking. So there's a punishment associated with this state. And you could also mean, basically this is like the classical COVID example that we talked about earlier. If you wash your hands, there's a certain probability when they are dirty that they become clean again, but there's also a chance that they actually stay dirty. And then there's a last way you can actually just try to get evidence from the environment by observing it, but the action itself, checking, doesn't really change anything about the state of the world itself. So that was the simple model that we came up with, and where you have a lot of parameters in here that you could actually be mapping onto beliefs. So the next thing we did is we actually simulated 10,000 of agents, and we said they all interact with the same environments, but they have different beliefs. So some believe that the cost of sickness is extremely high. So it's really the punishment that I'm receiving when my hands are dirty is very high. Others would, for instance, think that it's very likely that your hands get dirty. So whenever you touch something, there's a high probability it will actually turn into dirty hands. Or you could have an example where basically they distrust their successful avoidance actions. So they distrust that they can clean their hands well, and that might be a driver. So now you can simulate the behavior of those agents and see, well, who is actually showing repetitive behaviors, so it's repetitions of checking and washing as opposed to those that don't develop that behavior. and then see how are they different in their different beliefs. Here's the quick answer, because I don't want to go too much into detail in this. Turns out that both of those groups, those that displayed compulsive behaviors and those that didn't, actually have a fairly veridical representation of all of those parameters in the world. They don't necessarily overestimate a threat. They're different in one particular aspect only, which is that they underestimate their efficacy to avoid the punishment. In this case, they underestimate their efficacy in washing their hands. So they didn't trust that when they wash their hands, they actually turn out to be clean. And that is interesting because it maps onto something that has been observed in OCD for a long time that differentiates it from general anxiety disorder. In general anxiety, I might be very worried about the state of the world, but I'm not necessarily acting. In OCD, oftentimes you're acting to avoid a negative outcome. So there's a relationship between your own responsibility and the bad outcome out there in the world. If you don't trust yourself in being able to avoid that, that might actually be a driver of repetitive behavior. And that's interesting because now if you think about therapies, one thing that is done in OCD is exposure therapy, where you're really trying to face those behaviors and execute actions that you would otherwise avoid. So I wanted to basically just take these two examples as two different ways in which people have been trying to kind of get disease insights using computational models in this context of computational psychiatry. If you faded out because you were like, I'm not interested in models of OCD, now is a good time to fade back in, because now I want to talk about something different, which is how you can actually, if you have new disease insights, how do you really test whether they are valid? And what I mean by valid is that given that we don't fully trust the diagnostic categories we have right now, the validity of a model should not just be tested by, can I determine if someone has a depression or not, but can I actually say something meaningful that is clinically relevant for that individual? And something that is clinically relevant for an individual is, for instance, saying I can predict whether they're going to respond to treatment A or B, or I can predict that someone is at risk of relapse. And that suddenly makes it a prediction problem. You want to say something about an individual in a future state. And that's a really good way of trying to validate models. But it also means that you need a different type of data. Because most of the time when we're thinking of data, we don't think of data that are, we basically think of this classical idea of big data that I'm going to show you in a little bit. But here I want to have data points of an individual and how they're evolving over time, because that's really going to be clinically relevant data. So when we're thinking of big data, we typically say we just need massive data of different individuals and we want to classify. But in this case, what I think the kind of data that are going to be really relevant in the context of psychiatry, where our diagnosis don't perfectly lead to the right treatment, is what I would call deep and wide data. So deep data means that you have more data points of the individual over the course of time, that you can say something meaningful about their prediction in the future. And wide data obviously means that you get larger sample sizes across the population that is explaining that. And that's, interesting enough, some of the hardest data to get in science. And the reason for that is that most of our funding schemes actually provide grants that last up to 3 years, and by that time you ideally have finished your study and published your paper. But when you're thinking about longitudinal data, that often means I have to follow up people over months and sometimes over years. We just had one study where we looked at pathologic gambling, and we finished the data acquisition 8 years later. You can only do that if you're not relying on grant schemes that basically last 3 years. And I think part of the problem we have right now is that in science, we have to make a bigger effort to get this type of data. But also, when we are looking outside science, that data exists, but it's actually often proprietary. So companies own that type of data of you. If you logged into Facebook a couple of years ago, they definitely have a lot of those longitudinal data points on you. But it's usually not the data points that we can use to gain new insights on mental health. So I was a bit frustrated with that, and I was quite lucky when I came to Brown that I proposed to think about ways in which we could actually acquire longitudinal data. And I got core funding from Brown to build a tool. In this particular case, we built an app, and the app was focusing on pain because that was my new research interest. So what we've been building for 2 years now with a set of software engineers, designers, scientists is basically a platform where individuals can track their own pain over time. So they can enter that they've been receiving a treatment. So we released it actually last April. Since then we have 1,500 downloads. If you want to download it, you can do that on the left. It measures things like your current pain intensity, interference, unpleasantness, where in the pain people experiencing body, where they experience pain, their mood, their emotions, which medications they took, which treatments they took on a particular day, and which activities they engaged in. We asked about expectations and all sorts of other things. And we basically turned it into a tool that not just we can use it, because there was a lot of money and effort that went into this, but actually can be freely used by scientists all across the world. So now if you wanted to run a study, you can actually, the participant can log in and say, I'm part of study XYZ. You see there study-specific informed consent, and then the data will be acquired for a specific research study. So you can use it in clinical trials or in your own research if you're interested in that. Just reach out to me and we can discuss it. So why do we decide to do this type of data in pain, where we're asking someone about how much in pain do you have, how much do you bother? Well, the reason is that pain is something that you cannot assess with passive data yet. I talked to a former head of Apple Health, and he told me we always shied away from pain for a very particular reason. Neither your heart rate, nor your movements, nor anything predicts how much you are in pain or not. The only reliable report that we still have is subjective report for pain, which means you need experience sample. For many, many other things, I think that's no longer true. We actually can leverage passive data from your smartphones or from the environment. With pain, that's an interesting one, because we still rely on the subjective experience of the individual suffering. That's why we chose to have self-report as the key measure. Okay, so what are the kinds of questions that you can try to answer now that I think are interesting? Well, one is the example of chronic pain. So most of you sit in this room and you're sitting in a chair pretty much all day long. So there's a fair chance that some of you have back pain. And that's actually quite common amongst us, that we, many of us will end up having back pain. If you had an acute injury or you just had a surgery, then usually you should have an acute phase of pain where it really warns you of repeating the behavior that has been hurtful, not to step on the foot that was injured. But this shouldn't last too long. So for instance, after 3 to 6 months, most of the healing processes in the body are completed. The bad news is that more than 20% of Americans nowadays actually have pain that persists much longer than that period, and that's referred to as chronic pain. And if you're unlucky and you've developed chronic pain, you're actually set up to a really long and windy road through the healthcare system, where originally you might be treated with acute pain meds. There was a time where you actually received opioids. This has been decreasing, luckily, in the United States, and actually opioids turn out to be not a good treatment for chronic pain. You might receive physical therapy or much more invasive treatments like epidural injections or radiofrequency ablation if it's back pain. And again, there's a bad news here, because despite the fact that the treatments are really invasive, only 50% of those treatments actually provide long-term pain relief. Or in other words, to say 50% of these really invasive treatments actually fail to provide pain relief to the individuals. And the big question for a long time was, why is that the case? And there's multiple explanatory frameworks, but I think specifically in pain research, the notion has becoming that we have been focusing a lot on the periphery. We have been focusing a lot on nociception, the signal that is kind of entering the brain from the body and tells you about tissue damage. But there's multiple factors that actually contribute to pain that might be basically predicting whether pain is maintained, and that could be at the level of the brain. Some of the indication comes from the fact that if we are in this room more than, I guess most of us are above 30. So if you're 30 years old, there's a 50% chance that you have a disc degeneration in your back and you're asymptomatic, which means you're not reporting any pain. And if you're getting into kind of your 80s, then you're at 96%. But not 96% of people in their 80s actually report chronic back pain. So the truth is that there may be degenerations in your body that you easily adjust to, but they don't necessarily explain why you're experiencing pain. On the other hand, when you look at the brain during an acute pain phase as opposed to chronic pain, they actually seem to be representing completely different pain networks. So acute pain often activates the saliency network, basically drawing attention to the thing that's currently bothering you, while chronic pain actually seems to activate different brain circuits, particularly the mesolimbic system or pathways, where the idea has been that it's potentially associated with learning, and maybe chronic pain is a form of a learned response and a learned avoidance response. So really could be maintained not just by peripheral factors, but by central factors that are at the level of the brain. And so this is somewhat supported because we now know that expectations, fear, context, your social context actually are strongly influencing the degree to which you're experiencing pain, despite the tissue damage that you have in the body. So above and beyond that, there's a lot of central factors that influence your own subjective report of pain. Okay, let's go back to why that is a very interesting problem. The problem that we really want to address in pain is, first of all, you want to say, who is at risk of developing chronic pain after a certain period of time? Because then I could prevent, and that's something that Aldo mentioned earlier. Ideally, we want to focus on prevention, not just treatment. And the other one is to say, can we predict who is going to benefit from treatment? Specifically because radiofrequency ablation, for instance, costs several $1,000s to receive every time you get it. You're allowed to repeat it up to 8 times. So there's high healthcare costs associated with these treatments. We want to know if they're effective. So basically what we're doing right now is we run clinical trials where we try to ask these questions. We take computational markers, targets that basically explain how you're learning, together with measurements of kind of brain activity, to do basically studies where we both predict the response to peripheral treatments in back pain patients after they've received radiofrequency ablation, and we're looking at acute pain patients and see if we can predict whether they transition. And to do that, we really monitor how they're evolving over time. And so now you might be asking, why on earth would you need an app to actually get these continuous data? You could just ask them again after 4 months and you'd be done, and you wouldn't have to acquire continuous data. But there's another problem with pain, and that's why I wanted to use this example, where pain reports are actually highly variable, and only when we look at individuals over longer periods of time, we really understand what is going on. So let's take this example, where typically when you want to assess if someone is improving after an injury or surgery, you would ask them, how bad is your pain right now? And they would say a 6. That's actually fairly high on the 10-point scale. These are 2 participants that took part in our study. And then you ask them again 3 months later. You say, okay, how are you feeling now? One might say, actually, I'm feeling worse, I have more pain. And the other person might say, I'm feeling better. And if there's more of a 3-point decrease, then you would actually say that's a sign of recovery. Problem is, if you had asked this patient 1 day earlier, that would have been their pain report. If you had asked this patient 1 day later, that would have been their pain report. So pain is extremely variable, and single ratings often really fail to give you a full picture of recovery. And so when you look at the continuous data that we acquired over 4 months, you see that one person actually recovered, and there were early signs of recovery in the first 2 to 3 weeks. And then if you look at the other patient, he actually has chronic pain and high variability in their pain reports. And now the next answer could be, well, that's the problem is that people are just noisy in the way they're reporting pain. But it turns out there's a lot of meaningful information in this variation. So what we do now is with these large data sets that we have that are longitudinal, is we actually say how different factors are affecting this variability in pain that we see. And this is just to give you an example. We asked them about their emotions, and basically we see that every single positive emotion is correlated with a higher or like a lower pain score on that particular day, and every negative emotion is correlated with a higher pain score on that day. So emotions contribute massively to the variability that we see around pain. And that is likely very meaningful variability because, as we said, these emotional states actually influence the subjective experience of pain itself. And so then the question is, well, is this meaningful to say something about people that kind of 4 months from now, can I say much more about prediction by understanding how there's differences in recovery? And so basically we compared reports with a 4 months difference and wanted to see what is really predictive of whether you will be improving after 4 months or if you will be doing worse. And it turns out one of the questions we asked them is, well, what do you expect to feel like in 4 months? And the answer is that particular question was the best predictor of whether they would be better or not. Above and beyond the mere fact of their baseline pain, so it's their expectation beyond the fact that they have, obviously a baseline pain score, if you're correcting for that, also above and beyond the way you're assessing it, etc. So really your expectations 4 months from now are a determinator whether you will be improving or not. We have another study where we did the same thing around treatments, and we can show that the peripheral treatments, the best predictor of whether you're going to benefit from an injection into your back, is whether you expect to be benefiting from it prior to the actual treatment. That's again with a 2-week difference in this particular case. And now the question is, well, is this meaningful? I would say yes, because you can now think about belief interventions that are changing and working on expectations. And that's part of what we have been developing now over the past couple of weeks, is to think about, can we actually change beliefs around specific conditions in order to improve it? And that kind of moves more into the space of digital therapeutics that we heard about earlier. To wrap this up, I think what I wanted to highlight is that I think in psychiatry we have a slightly different problem than we have in classical medicine, which is that the way we've been diagnosing people has been heavily relying on symptoms and syndromes. And if we just try to make new treatments or predictors in this space, we obviously fail to explain a lot of the mechanistic differences that we actually might be observing in psychiatric disorders. And we should move away from trying to treat syndromes to trying to treat mechanisms and causes. And that's a way where computational psychiatry could really help gain those insights into mechanisms and causes. The other part that I wanted to point out, though, is that if you really want to now validate those new models that might be mechanistic or causal, they still live in the space of the DSM. So if you want to show that they have validity, instead of just saying they allow you to categorize or label individuals, you should try to answer meaningful questions, and these are meaningful questions about how their diseases will evolve over time. So really, computational assays, the idea behind that is to use those models of disease mechanisms, apply them to brain activity, behavior, or individual patients in order to detect those subgroups of dimensions that are different based on their mechanism, and then allow individual treatment, prediction, and development. And I really think this later part requires a whole different type of data, which is longitudinal data that are often hard to get in science. And I think we should make active efforts to really try to get and develop those types of data sets and share them openly in the community. And with that, I want to thank my amazing team and my collaborators at Brown University. And if you're interested in this project, you can download it and contact me. Thank you.
Wow, fantastic. I'm already looking forward to the next round when you have solved all these problems. Let's get over and see what our audience... there's another one here. Switch it on here. Should be on. So, Days.
Well, very interesting talk. One thing that really struck me toward the end is the relationship with predictive brain hypothesis kind of ideas about the role of expectation in things like chronic pain. There are these anecdotes of things like, construction worker gets a spike through the boot, is in extreme pain, needs to get treated for it and so on, and then it's discovered that the spike didn't actually pierce a toe at all. And of course, the moment he realizes this, then the pain goes away. But in general, this problem of people's illness, you're dealing with a system that is learning, and in which the role of expectation feeds back on what happens. And I would imagine this is quite general. It's not just about pain. So do you worry about sort of pitting two predictive systems against each other, which in effect is what you're doing with all of your modeling, that you're sort of chasing something that is running away from you? Does the question make sense?
Yes, and I think it has two parts. The first one is related to how much do the symptoms that we observe have to do with predictions that we're making? And I think you're quite right. Specifically in the context of pain, I think what the brain has to solve is an inference problem, where it gets sensory inputs and it has to figure out, is this a threat to my physiological integrity, yes or no? So if I'm stepping onto something and I'm actually hurt, I should stop walking on that because I can create further tissue damage, and that's exactly what I want to avoid, and that's what acute pain serves. If I infer that there is a damage, like in the example of the construction worker, I should also stop walking and I have that experience of pain, unless I realize there was actually no threat. And so pain has a lot to do with threats and fears around injury. So the experience of pain can be both driven by the actual input from the periphery, but it can also be driven by central factors. And I actually worry less about that we can not kind of address that with computational models, but rather I think that we really need high-quality scientific data showing these effects, because the way we're treating pain at the moment is not acknowledging that aspect at all. We're basically treating the periphery, and that across the board. And it's also for patients extremely hard to acknowledge that there may be central factors, because they feel stigmatized, which I think is completely wrong, because there is a biological underpinning. The origin is just elsewhere. And if you really wanted to treat it, you would have to treat it elsewhere. So these insights are actually going to shift the way that we are treating like symptoms that both arise in the body and in the brain. It kind of gets back to what Aldo was saying earlier, that we have to think of us as an embodied system that has not just a brain, but also physiology. To kind of give you a bit of a sense of how you could actually get at some of this. So we're really interested in this aspect of relief. So if relief is actually something that is extremely meaningful to chronic pain patients, because it's a way to avoid pain. And you can study relief using cognitive models, and we're actually seeing quite substantial differences between chronic pain patients and healthy individuals. And by tapping into that learning system, you understand, okay, that actually has to do with dopamine. Dopamine is not the typical target when you're thinking about pain. So maybe this will lead us to think about new treatment courses as well.
Okay, audience first. Yeah, please.
Thank you. I'm curious about the Soma app and whether you are connecting it to other data sources to track some of those longitudinal outcomes, and basically just how interconnected Soma is with other data types.
Yeah, it's a really good question. We just wrote a grant. If we get it, the answer is it's going to be very interconnected. If not, it's going to take a little longer. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that everybody is getting very excited about passive data. And me too, but as I mentioned, for pain, they're not ideal because they really don't tell you that much. But you want to know if physiological metrics of recovery are associated at all with physiological or like psychological metrics of recovery. So that's why I'm testing this ring here, by the way. It's the Aura ring. They have been developing a ring that you can wear that tracks sleep, that tracks heart rate, it tracks temperature. And the idea is to integrate their data that they get from the passive device with our data that tell us something about actual experiences. So that's the first integration. We also thought about the integration with electronic health records. And that one is a bit of a harder step. And the reason is that we took a lot of care regarding data privacy. We basically know nothing about the users, and we don't want to. So the only thing that they ever enter is an email address, and the only reason that has to be entered is to recover your password. There's no names, there's no location data, nothing. And I think it's a big problem with the data that we're acquiring right now is privacy. And electronic health records are a whole different story. Then you would know everything about people. So you have to find a way to completely separate it from the type of data that we have. And we've been very careful to not get into a space where information is personalized yet.
Stephanie, is there anything from our online audience?
Yes. Is computation the easiest function to measure WRT brain function, and what about emotion?
Sorry, can you repeat the last one?
Is computation the easiest function to measure WRT brain function, and what about emotion?
I'm not 100% sure if I fully understand the question, but if not, they can repeat it. I think the first question is computation the best way to measure the brain or brain function? And I think part of the function of the brain is computation. I would basically rephrase it. I think a lot of the things that we do are basically computational processes that our networks are carrying out, and therefore trying to reverse engineer some of this is actually quite useful. And we've seen various different ways of trying to get at that. For instance, in Dan's talk earlier, where we basically looked at the visual system. I think that's a completely new way of trying to understand the architecture of the visual system using these models. And so they can allow us to gain both insights into biological systems and potentially vice versa. Regarding emotions, I think emotions are very interesting because the reason I started to study body-brain interactions, I used to do computational models of lower level perception, space and time perception. And then I moved into computational psychiatry. And that was what got me really interested in studying the body, because emotions arise because they are signals from the physiology of your body that help you, they basically are part of the emotional experience. And if we ignore the fact that we have a body, we'll have a hard time explaining emotional processes. So that's why I started to study interoception, exactly for the reason that I think we have excluded bodily signals for a long time in our models. And there is new attempts to kind of have computational models of interoceptive processes that try to include this more. It gets more and more complex and harder to do, but I think that is a way to try to get new insights into emotions using computation as well. Yeah.
Okay, great. Another question is, can the AI LLM detect these computations that are otherwise not perceptible to us humans?
The AI LM?
Yeah, it says, can the AI LLM?
Large learning.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if that was referred to any particular slide that I had.
I don't know which slide it was, but we can move on to the next question. It says, what do you think the role of psychiatrists with the tools that computational psychiatry will provide?
Oh, I see. That's a very interesting question, because I don't think the point is to replace psychiatrists at all. I think that's a misconception. In Aldo's talk, we've seen one version where that could take, where it's basically a way to aid psychiatry and psychiatrists to provide better care, potentially. I think where this could really start to play an important role is developing new targets for treatment, and so optimizing treatments around sub-mechanisms that can be both cognitive therapies, actually. So for instance, with cognitive behavioral therapy, it's quite interesting. We have a set of more or less a manual. Not everybody sticks to it, but we don't really know what the active ingredient is. We don't really know what the change is that is being induced. You can actually start to measure that. That's part of what we're really interested in, is trying to understand what are the components of therapy that work for an individual, and potentially make it more personalized, and then combine it, obviously, with classical care. I think there's no way, and also should not be the goal to replace classical psychiatry, but to aid it.
Great, thank you. There is one last question here. How accurate is the Oura Ring? Last I checked, not so much for tracking sleep, unless you're pairing it with AI technology.
Yeah, so when I talked to them, what I wanted to have is a way to, so I study something which is called the heartbeat evoked potential. It means how you're processing every single heartbeat in the brain. And I wanted to use the ring to trigger every single heartbeat. Can't do that. It takes averages. But there is a paper out there that actually compares this to other devices, and they're all fairly okay for certain markers like heart rate. On average, that's totally fine. If you want to do fancy stuff that I wanted to do with it, not everything is working, but yeah. It's not an EKG. If you wanted to have an EKG, there is, I think the Apple Watch allows it, but then you need a closed loop, so you have to put a finger on it to get actual EKG data from those devices nowadays, but it's possible.
Okay, thank you. Those are the questions from the virtual part.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, so I think we have to say thank you, Frederike, again.